Well, welcome back to the program. Time now for Media Week with my co-host, James Manning, who joins us live in the studio, editor and publisher of Media Week. Great to have you on the program, as always.
Hi, Ingrid.
Let's get up to speed with some of the news we're watching this week. And, of course, we are watching those former Fairfax media brands, the SMH and the Age, finally sort of launching, I guess, their first marketing campaign under Nine. Are we seeing anything
It's one of the
different?
big moves, I guess, that we've been waiting for Nine to do something with the existing brands. And they've sort of left them alone a little bit. There's a lot been going on behind the scenes, of course. But they've launched a big promotional campaign. They want more subscribers for both the Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. Of course, they have a mixed model, if you like. They have a paywall online. You get a certain number of articles free every month, but then you have to pay. And Nine aren't going to mess with that business model too much, so they've got a big campaign, and they're stressing the same things that the old Fairfax media used to sell both the Age and the Sydney Morning Herald on, and that's the quality of their journalism, if you like. The tagline is independent always. Nine's stuck with that. And they're just sort of stressing the investigative journalism, the teams they have working in both Melbourne and Sydney, the people who've, multi-award winners, people leading those teams, and they're just promoting that as key. And they've got Fairfax media people, Chris Jans and James Chessel, the sort of senior editorial people at both the Sydney Morning Herald and the Age. They're spearheading this. They're explaining how it works, and so we're seeing Nine tread very carefully about moving in and sort of seeing to take control. Yeah, I think we may have some pictures of these, but just when you look at this, I guess, of course they don't want to make too many big changes, right? I mean, not off the bat of, new ownership, do you think? Because there was a lot of criticism at the time. Yeah. I mean, a lot of people, and some of the criticism was from Nine or Fairfax's competitors. They didn't think it was a smart
as you would imagine.
a smart merger. We'll probably find out some more 2 weeks today when Nine presents its results. Yeah, that's that campaign there. Banks is a very timely one, of course, this week. And Fairfax, and they used to work with the ABC, Four Corners. They used to do joint investigations. We're expecting we might see some of those happening with Nine's news brands soon. But yeah, the Hugh Marks will be reporting in 2 weeks. We'll hear a little bit more detail then about what they've got planned. We're expecting to hear maybe an update on the sales process for those regional titles, and maybe what's happening in New Zealand, which we think they will divest as well. All right, well, we'll see how Nine's going in the ratings as well shortly when we get the TV ratings a little later in the program. But let's switch gears to BBC News, because it's been named the #1 international news brand in Australia amongst influential audiences, including millennials. The news organisation recently asked Australian audiences about news sources which revealed concerns about agenda-driven news and credibility of news. Visiting Australia to talk about what this means for the BBC here is Jamie Angus, the director of BBC World Service Group, who joins us today. Jamie, pleasure to have you on the program. Thanks so much for joining us. So what's the research been telling you about Australian news audiences specifically? Well,
we're very interested in how audiences in Australia perceive, independent news and agenda-driven news in a time of great consolidation here in Australia, and you've just been talking about Fairfax 9 in that context. And we saw that 3/4 of Australian audiences feel that they're seeing more agenda-driven news than they were 5 years ago, and that Australian audiences are worried when they look across to America and see what's happened with the great polarisation in American media, that the country might be heading in the right direction. So we're part of a really diverse media climate here in Australia as an international provider, but a trusted international provider. We just wanted to hear a bit more from audiences about what they were worried about, particularly around this idea of agenda-driven news.
Jamie, I guess this is the next step up from what we initially talked about when fake news became a thing. Audiences are a lot more aware now, I guess, wary of sources of news, and if they're being told is true.
Well, that is true, and obviously the conversation around fake news has been going on at some level for certainly since at least 2016, when Donald Trump, apart from anyone else, made it into a kind of global talking point. But other research we've done with international audiences show that people consistently overestimate their ability to detect fake news, so people feel more confident than possibly they should. And we think that although Australia is a fantastic and robust and mature media market in lots of ways, we do still think there's a problem about supporting supporting high-quality commercial providers as well as PSBs, public service broadcasters like the BBC and the ABC, because of those huge problems in the digital market, which mean that commercial news providers are struggling to make the ad revenue and commercial revenues that they previously did in the past. And, you know, every country on earth, even those with big mature media markets like in Australia, have those problems. And, you know, we see a great mixed economy here where commercial providers, you were just talking about the SMH and the Age, using the tagline independence in their title. We talk a lot in the BBC about our independence. We have to protect trust in the independence of quality news providers, because if we don't, the risk is that increasingly young audiences in particular will just feel that, well, all news is low quality. We don't have to pay for it. That has no value, and we believe very strongly that it does. There
needs to be that differentiation point, as you say. Now, I know you use Facebook for distribution, as most do. Are they really working hard, Facebook, to stop the dissemination of fake news? Is this something that's front of mind, do you think?
Well, they're certainly talking about working hard, and I think, you know, the measures that Facebook have set out involve them putting sort of global funds available to support particular media products, but they, Facebook, decide where the money goes. And, you know, we've been concerned in the past. You know, we looked at Facebook's operation in Nigeria, for example, that their ability to detect fake news in Nigeria, where the BBC has huge audiences, and we operate in Nigerian vernacular languages. And we were worried that Facebook didn't have any Hausa language speakers, for example, in northern Nigeria. And I think you have to look at that kind of more detailed level about, and the same was true with the problems in Burma, in Myanmar, that surfaced with fake news on Facebook there, that do you actually have the language ability to detect this content at scale? I'm not sure that Facebook are there yet, and certainly broadcasters like us are working with Facebook, with WhatsApp, with other tech platforms to try and call this really dangerous content out.
There's been a little bit of discussion this week, and there is all the time. We're on a commercial news service now. They always compete with, they always compete on different levels with public broadcasting organisations. They're always concerned about it, some more than others. What's your attitude, and what's the BBC's attitude about competing in different, I guess it varies where you are around the world?
Well, we have the same discussions in Britain as they're going on here in Australia. And I suppose my view, you wouldn't be surprised to hear this, is that we think a strong public service broadcaster climate working alongside quality commercial providers is the right mix, and each nation and democracy and regulator has to ask itself, well, what's the exact right balance? Like, is there anything that the PSB is doing that is overly interfering in the competitive market? And certainly there have been instances in the UK where the BBC has stopped some of its licence fee funded peripheral services, not core news, but some of the peripheral services, because it's having too much of a market impact. And every country has to take those own decisions, but my feeling is that a strong PSB is a prerequisite for a really strong and mature media market, but that when it's well regulated, commercial quality providers can coexist happily alongside a strong PSB that often helps to, you know, maintain training and standards and journalism alongside its commercial competitors, and that feels like the right place to be.
Looking at global expansion, and you were just talking about Nigeria, but on what platforms is the BBC content expanding fastest on at the moment?
Well, clearly our digital platforms are the areas of biggest growth. I mean, our linear audiences are still huge, interestingly. You know, we still have 100 million people a week watching BBC World News on TV around the world. So the idea that maybe we thought 5 and 10 years ago that TV was in a, you know, we'd reached peak TV and it had gone downhill, actually, that's not the case. But in terms of the rate of growth, that digital growth is very high. But like all international and national broadcasters, we have challenges with digital growth, which is that if content is seen on third-party platforms, so if people are seeing it on an aggregation platform, maybe, and not on a BBC site, they might not remember it's from the BBC, the kind of attribution is poor, and actually we want to build those really loyal relationships with audiences in the digital space that we had historically in the past through radio, for World Service Radio and World News TV.
How are you doing that?
Well, I think it's, you know, we want people to come back onto platforms, so we want people to use bbcnews.com, we want people to use our language service sites, we want people to use the BBC News app, because then you get a more enduring relationship, just like here on this station. You want people on your own platforms because they'll return for multiple visits and consume more of your digital content.
You're doing a lot in languages other than English around the world. Is there much growth left in many territories for your English language service?
I think there probably still is, actually. I mean, I think, you know, if you look at, for example, a country like India, where there's actually quite a significant English-speaking news audience. Even if English isn't their first language, people will often consume news in English for preference. So there's still headroom for growth there. You know, this Australian audience is very important to us. We're always happy for new people to come to us here and in the United States. And, you know, Anglophone parts of the world, there's still headline room for growth. But I think some of the really big untapped audiences are in vernacular languages, particularly, you know, in parts of India and in China, where the really huge population centres are, where they're speaking languages where they're not overly well served, perhaps, with quality news content.
You'd think brand would always be a good thing. I mean, there are parts of the world where BBC brand actually helps for access, but other parts where actually it can be a bit of a hindrance, just having that news branding. Yeah,
well, that's certainly true in China, for example.
Yeah.
You know, a market that every news organisation internationally is interested in China. And although some of our English language news is unblocked in China, all of our Chinese language news is blocked by the Great Firewall of China, and that is actively maintained to make sure that Chinese audiences can't consume BBC News in Chinese. And that's frustrating to us. But of course, over time it may change. It may not, but that is kind of out of our control. All we can do is put the news out there in Mandarin, and we do a certain amount of Cantonese radio as well, just to hope that over time those changes in China, which we're all observing from the outside, will mean that more and more audiences can grow for BBC News.
Brexit, how important is that?
Got to ask about Brexit.
Yeah, how important is that to watch? Obviously, it's majorly important in the UK, but what's the appetite like outside of Europe for updates regularly on what's happening?
I think people recognise globally that Brexit is a global story. It's a story because it matters to the huge trading bloc of the EU as well as to the UK economy.
Well, we talk about it every day on the show, so let's just say there's certainly an appetite in the financial markets.
Okay, well, I'll try and answer your questions. I mean, I think it's, you know, this is one of the greatest UK politics stories I've ever lived through, and whatever you think of it, it's driving audiences in the UK and internationally because people want organisations like the BBC to explain for those international trade deals, how would the UK trade in international trading blocs outside the EU? If it stayed in a customs union, could it still do that? If there was a no-deal Brexit, how would that affect? You know, so for our international business-focused audience, those kinds of questions are really, really important.
Can you gauge public interest, I guess, in specialist news areas? And is there anything that's sort of been creating interest recently? Anything specific? Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, I think so. Audience interest in this question of, you know, kind of fake news busting, like fact checking, reality check. We have a BBC reality check strand where quite often audiences just have a really simple ask of us, which is like, is this disputed fact true or not?
Right.
And actually, the BBC can perform a really important role, being a sort of trusted fact checker. We see, for example, the Indian elections that are coming up shortly, the Nigerian presidential election that's going on at the moment, these big national elections of global significance, where actually facts are genuinely hotly disputed, and people will often look to the BBC to provide just a really straightforward, is this true or not? Or it could even be President Trump in the State of the Union saying, if I hadn't been president, we'd be in a war with North Korea. Well, it's uncheckable, that suggestion. But
what are you going to do?
Yeah, and ratings. I mean, I ask you about ratings. I guess in markets where you operate commercially, where you take advertising, ratings are obviously essential for your salespeople. Does the editorial team find much use for them?
Well, you know, like as you say, we operate as a commercial news broadcaster for BBC World News and BBC.com. So, of course, we want people to come to the channels and to watch them. But I think we have a unique role as a public service broadcaster that we are able to take those editorial decisions that aren't totally reliant on driving clicks and audiences. You know, we believe in the product and its independence and its appeal. And we think people come to the BBC because it's independent and trusted, and because people know that even within the commercial model, we have that kind of public service ethos.
All right, Jamie, well, we'll have to leave it there. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but we really appreciate you joining us on the program today. Thank you.
Nice to be here.
Jamie Angus, there, Director of BBC World Service Group, joining us on the program. But before we head to a break, we've got to quickly do weekly ratings. We're up to week 3 now, James. What are we seeing across the board?
It's actually week 5.
Week 5? Yep. Yep. There you go, week 5. We've moved out through a couple of weeks now, haven't we?
We're actually in February. We're actually in February, Ingrid.
So I'm stuck in January.
Breaking news. But look, the Australian Men's Open, biggest thing by a mile. That was the end of, or the first night of this ratings week. Doing very well. We've talked about this before. Married at First Sight, still doing huge business for Channel 9. Nearly got up to 1.3 million in Metro this week.
Wow.
Which are just sort of unheard numbers these days for a TV program.
It's beating Marketing Rules this year, isn't it?
Yeah, look, absolutely doing fantastic business.
And there's 7 and 9 News as tends to get in there. Let's move on and take a look at subscription television for week 5.
Yeah,
and
look,
there you have it.
It's all cricket. Look, it's only 2 spots on our top 5 because we only put cricket in once or twice, but the actual chart, the top 30 shows were all cricket programs. So different matches, tea breaks, lunch breaks.
Yep.
People are obsessed with the cricket on their Foxtel subscription this year.
Sport always does well. James, we will leave it there with you, but really appreciate it as always. We'll see you next week.
Thanks, Ingrid.
James Manning, editor and publisher of Mediaweek, here with me.